right, so bited the apple, it's more like the top steel champion pumpkin that we're trying to bite into. Big and not very chewable. So anyway, I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview on that number of 20 parts per trillion and try to give everybody a bit of a flavor for where that value came from. You know, is it the right value, is it too high, too low? Hopefully everybody will get some insight to the thinking that went into our deriving that value. So as an overview, talk a little bit about big picture health concerns associated with these compounds. I think probably everybody in this audience is well aware of what those are. Just to sort of set the stage for why we're worried about these compounds in drinking water in the first place. Quick overview of the current ORSG, that's our state Guideline, Office of Research and Standards Guideline for drinking water. An overview of the process that's used to derive these drinking water guidelines at a fairly high level without going into a huge amount of detail, including how we derive the various toxicity values that we apply in this calculation. A quick summary, and this is going to be a complicated table, but we won't spend a lot of time on it, about where other agencies, not here in Massachusetts, but other state agencies and federal agencies have come down on drinking water values for these compounds. A quick summary of the key elements in our updated ORS assessment where we derive the 20 part per trillion value, that MCP GW1 value, some conclusions, and then hopefully some time for questions. All right, so the health risk concerns, again, I'm sure everybody knows these compounds can cross the placenta. Therefore, there are fetal exposures that are of concern. And in fact, you see that developmental risks are one of the endpoints that we are particularly concerned about with respect to exposures to these compounds. They're also expressed in breast milk. So nursing is another pathway of exposure that's of concern. So the infant neonate is a particular concern to us. These compounds are slowly excreted from the body, so in addition to being very persistent in the environment, once they're released into the general environment, once you take them into the body, they last a long time. So for the compounds we're focused on, the serum half-life estimates range from 1 to 8 or more years, so it's really a long time. So that enhances our concern about these compounds because they're not cleared particularly quickly from the body. These are amongst some of the more slowly excreted compounds that we deal with. Risks that we're concerned about, as I mentioned, include risks to the fetal development, including developmental delays, effects on bone development, mammary gland development, and liver development. There have also been studies documenting reduced immune responses to vaccine in children and some modest minimal reductions in birth weight that have been associated with these compounds as well. Endocrine disruption, including thyroid hormone effects, have been reported now in a number of animal bioassay studies. And there are elevated risks of cancer associated with cancers of the kidney, the testes, from some human studies, epidemiological studies, and pancreatic cancer from animal bioassays. So there are a fairly wide range of health effects that we are concerned about. All right, so the current Massachusetts guideline, we adopted this in June 12, 2018. And in essence, what we did is we adopted the EPA Health Advisory, which was developed by EPA for PFOS and PFOA, which was very extensively and well documented and well supported. Our view, however, was that there were additional compounds that were of concern that were included in that UCMR3 testing protocol that Stephanie mentioned earlier. So we were asked to address these other compounds, my Office of Research and Standards, because we were getting test results from some water supplies in Massachusetts where these things were showing up. So the question was, they're there, should we be concerned about them or not? So we took a pretty deep dive look at the literature and research on this. And we concluded for a number of reasons that these closely related compounds, PFHxS, PFHpA, PFNA, were structurally very similar, exhibited similar half-lives and similar toxicity profiles, and therefore we thought they should be treated the same as PFOS and PFOA, and we included them in our guidance value. So this is the same approach that's been used by Connecticut, or is being used by Connecticut. And also Vermont. Vermont is currently using 20 parts per trillion. Connecticut is at the 70 parts per trillion, which is our current guideline. This value was reviewed and unanimously endorsed by a standing committee of scientists and public health experts, our Health Effects Advisory Committee in 2018. Shortly after we issued this guideline on June 12th, at the end of the month, the ATSDR issued their tox profile for fluorinated compounds. And we'll get to that in a minute, because basically their report suggested that lower values might be more appropriate. So what are the steps that we take to derive a drinking water value or guideline or standard here? So in essence, there are a number of different components that go into these calculations. One needs a toxicity value, which is a measure of the potency of the compound. The EPA terminology for that toxicity value is a reference dose or RfD. The ATSDR, which is another federal agency that does toxicity evaluations, they term these minimum risk levels, or MRLs, but they're basically the same thing. And there are measurements of dose in typically milligrams per kilogram per body weight per day that are anticipated to be without an appreciable risk of deleterious effects during a lifetime of exposure. These values can also be used and applicable to shorter-term exposures when you've got a concern about a developmental endpoint, as you do for these compounds. Then you have to consider, and I'll also note here that the EPA definition also notes that these have an associated uncertainty spanning perhaps an order of magnitude. So that would be square root of 10 below the value, square root of 10 above the value. So within that range, EPA estimates that the true value would lie. In order to calculate a drinking water value from that toxicity value, you need to identify who your most susceptible subgroup is. It can be an adult, lactating woman, or an infant. EPA chose in their health advisory development process to focus on lactating woman. We did the same. And a water consumption rate appropriate to the group that you're looking at. So lactating woman would drink about 3.2 liters per day. It's a value that we've used. And this term, relative source contribution, that Paul mentioned that we were eliciting specific comment for in the MCP public comment process, EPA used 20%. This means 20% of that sort of allowable or target dose to come from drinking water, allowing 80% of it to come from other sources of exposure. And we know for these compounds that we are exposed to these things in our diets, in food, home products, consumer products, etc. So we have used 20% as well. So those are the components, and what's important to note here is depending upon which of these values you choose in your calculation, you'll come up with a different output, a different health advisory value, a different drinking water value at the end of the process. So how do we derive the toxicity values? And I'm focusing in on this because we are in fact using a different toxicity value in our new proposal than the EPA value. We look at all of the data that's available. I shouldn't say all of it because this is a constantly changing and evolving data set. We try to keep up with it, but we're probably a little bit behind in terms of the data that's out there. But we look at the human data, the epidemiological studies that are out there. For those of you familiar with this, epidemiology is a pretty crude tool in terms of its sensitivity to detect effects. We're not doing experiments on people. This is what people are experiencing in their general lives, and we try to tease out what effects are associated with various exposures. The animal data, typically from rodent bioassays, but there may be other sources of data as well. And then other classes of data, which could include in vitro data, which is sort of laboratory data, tests with a petri dish, understanding of the mechanisms of action, for which we don't have a really great understanding for these perfluorinated compounds, structure activity relationships which relate to this read across, which is to use data from structurally similar compounds to provide information about a compound that you have less information on. And in essence, that's sort of what we've done in combination with looking at the animal data. So we evaluate, toxicologists evaluate the studies and the endpoints for the quality of the study and assess the dose response of information, and then select what's known as a point of departure. This term will come up in a few slides later. POD, we call it a point of departure, which is the dose, lowest dose at which a relevant adverse response occurs in the test animal, typically is what we're looking at here. And then you have to extrapolate those results from the animals to people. And there are a bunch of different variety of techniques for doing that. In this case, a pharmacokinetic model, fairly sophisticated model, is used to extrapolate the serum concentration that are observed in the animals to people. You have to do that because the rodents, animals, clear this stuff much more quickly than humans do. So our long-term dose, once we're exposed to this, is much longer, much greater than what the animals experience. There are some other approaches, including allometric scaling, which EPA used in their proposed GenX and PFHxS values, but we're not going to get into that. And then appropriate uncertainty factors, sometimes referred to as safety factors, apply to account for the fact we have fundamental scientific uncertainty about how the results in the animals would relate to the sensitivity of people to derive a final toxicity value. All right, so different agencies have made different choices in terms of which parameters they've used to derive their drinking water values. So EPA Health Advisory said it's a sum of 2 for PFOS and PFOA. As I mentioned, after we issued our ORSG, APSBR came out with a report with lower toxicity values, more stringent toxicity values, which if you use the same exposure parameters that EPA applied in their health advisory derivation, we would come up with values about 10 times lower for PFOS and PFOA, 7 to 10 times lower. They also derive values for PFNA and the hexasulfonate. Now, a number of other states have done more recent assessments and evaluations than the EPA health advisory, and the numbers are displayed here. As I noted, MassDEP is currently at 70, and we're proposing to go, our ORSG, we're proposing to go to 20, the GW1 standard, which is a drinking water appropriate standard. Currently, we're addressing 5 compounds, and we're proposing to add 6, and I'll explain that in a moment. Most states are relying on EPA value of 70. Again, most states haven't done a deep dive looking at this. The states that have, by and large, have moved towards lower numbers. I'll note that New Hampshire has a proposed MCL value. They're supposed to come out with revised values very soon, in the next few days, and purportedly they will be lower than what's on this table right here. I don't know how much lower, but I've been told that they will be considerably lower. So New Hampshire is also moving towards lower numbers. And as I mentioned, Vermont is also summing across the same 5 covered by our current guideline at a target of 20, and that has been legislatively mandated at this point. All right, so the basis of the GW1 standards. First of all, why the compounds? Why this list of compounds? Where did we come up with these? All right, so the current ORSG, as I've already mentioned, in that UCM R3 testing, there were 6 PFAS compounds that were covered, that were addressed. We are addressing 5 of those in our ORSG. That's the 5 longer chain compounds. PFBS, which is a 4-carbon shorter chain compound, which is much less persistent in the human body and much less toxic based on the available information, was not included in our target list for the ORSG, current ORSG. So that's how we selected those 5 compounds. And again, we're treating them the same based on their being very similar in chemical structures, having long half-lives, similar toxicity endpoints, and where the data is available, similar potencies. In our update, we looked at the compounds that are covered in EPA method 537. We used as a cutoff here 6 to 8 compounds that are 6 to 8 carbons in chain length. So again, very similar to PFOS and PFOA, so plus or minus 2 from those compounds. One compound that falls into that category is the hexa acid. We did not include that because a preliminary look at the toxicity information indicated that it's considerably less toxic and less persistent in the body, so it was not included in our revised proposal for the MCP GW1. This results in the same original 5 compound plus that PFDA, so that's the 10 carbon chain compound. that sort of gives you an explanation for how we've landed up at these compounds. That's not to say that we have absolutely no concerns about any of the other ones. We do, but they're probably going to have different toxicities in terms of comparison to PFOS and PFOA, and we really couldn't justify treating them the same based on the information that we had available. All right, so what did we do for toxicity values? When we looked at the literature again after ATSDR came out with their report, it was pretty clear that there were multiple effects that were reported in literature studies on animals, bioacid, that were occurring at lower exposure levels than EPA used as that point of departure in their RfD derivation. All right, so that indicated to us that maybe that EPA value wasn't sufficient to help protect for PFOS and PFOA. So for PFOS, the endpoints that have lower exposure levels with toxicity being reported include immunotoxicity effects, effects on the liver, the thyroid, and some of the developmental effects, in particular on skeletal abnormalities. So a number of effects. For PFOA, again, there are a number of developmental effects that have been reported at lower concentrations than that point of departure chosen by EPA, including effects on the mammary gland and liver, effects on thyroid hormone production, and on the liver. So our updated toxicity values. All right, so we're not the only ones coming up with lower toxicity values for these compounds. I'll point that out. ATSDR did, so there's another federal agency, released their draft values. But a number of the other state agencies that have looked at this have come up with lower RfD, lower toxicity values for these compounds. Some of them selected one particular study and an endpoint from one study uses a POD, a point of departure, to generate a lower value. Others applied an additional uncertainty factor to account for the fact that there's a lot of data out there suggesting greater toxicity, but without putting too fine a point on it. Some used a factor of 10, some used a square root of 10. Those are sort of the two standard options that could be applied here. So there are examples of both. When we looked at it, we decided that the uncertainty factor approach made the most sense from our point of view. And we applied that to the USEPA RfD derivations, which we thought were, again, very well documented and a strong basis for a starting point. And again, this is an approach that has been used by ATSDR and some other agencies, and it is consistent with EPA guidance on how one can do this. We took this approach, again, because there are multiple studies that raised concerns about effects at lower doses of exposure. But when you looked at each individual study on its own, there are uncertainties in either the studies or in the interpretation of the results of those studies that limited our confidence in selecting those as a point of departure, specific point of departure for calculating a new RfD. So we thought the uncertainty factor approach was a more applicable approach reflective of the data. All right, so what about the other compounds? Well, we certainly looked at the other compounds. PFNA, there is some limited half-life, serum half-life data, which demonstrates that the serum half-life is similar or perhaps a bit longer than PFOA, which is a structurally related compound. Animal estimates are in fact longer for this compound, which we would predict on the basis of its carbon chain length. Limited toxicity data, but there is some toxicity data. And for agencies that have used that toxicity data to derive a value, it comes out to be very similar to PFOS and PFOA. Within a factor of probably 20-30%, which we think is equivalent. So we're treating that the same as PFOS and PFOA, and it's a data-driven number. Hexasulfonate, the half-life data is pretty good for the hexasulfonate and demonstrates sort of surprisingly that it's longer than PFOS, even though it's one carbon shorter, which is kind of not expected, but that's what the data indicates. The toxicity value that's available is more extensive than for the other three compounds on this chart, but considerably less extensive than for PFOS and PFOA. So it's really hard to compare endpoints one compound to another. So pending more robust data, our decision was at this point to do this read across from PFOS, which is the most structurally similar compound, and treat it the same. And basically, to summarize, it's the same for the HepA acid and PFHpA. The HepA acid, there's very little toxicity data. Based on the structural similarities, we would expect that the T-half half-life would be shorter. There's some very limited data suggesting that that is the case. Very little comparable toxicity data for that compound. And again, so pending more robust data on those issues, we decided to treat it the same. And then the DECA, the 10, there is half-life data that's limited, but again, suggests it would be longer than PFNA and PFOA, the structural analogs for that compound. Little toxicity data, but what's available indicates it's similar to PFNA. So we again are applying the structural read across to treat it the same as PFOS and PFOA. So that's how we get to the point of summing across all 6 of these compounds using the same toxicity value. All right, what about the exposure parameters? Well, in our original ORSG, we relied on the values that were selected and used by EPA in their health advisory derivation, and we have continued to do that. So the body weight and water intake rates of the nursing mother, relative source contribution factor of 20%, and we are expanding or extending the EPA additivity approach that they applied only to PFOS and PFOA to the full 6 compounds that I've been talking about. And we have tried to elicit comments in the MCP public comment process on whether these were appropriate assumptions or not. So conclusions, using the revised toxicity value of RfD that we've developed and applying the EPA exposure parameters in relative source contribution term, the derived drinking water value comes in at just below 20 parts per trillion, which we will round to an insignificant figure, which leads us to 20 parts per trillion. And this would be applicable to the 6 compounds. So this is the same value that Vermont is at. We've got there through a different process, but we're, at least we have 2 states that have consistent numbers, unlike lots of other states where the numbers are all over the place. So next steps, as Paul indicated, we're soliciting public comment through the MCP process. We are also eliciting technical input from our Health Effects Advisory Committee, the same committee that I mentioned before. We've had 1 meeting of that committee where they supported the approach underlying the ORSG before we came out with that. And they continue to support the approach that we're taking now, but requested some additional analysis and clarification information that we presented to them, and we're in the process of working that up. And that's it. If anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to address them.
Can you speak to the dose response curve? Is it steep for PFAS?
It depends on which endpoint you're looking at. And I give you an example. The NTP completed a 28-day rodent study, and the most sensitive endpoint in that study is thyroid effect data. And the effects on the thyroid hormones in that study for all these compounds, except the HepA acid, which was not included, is very steep, which makes doing the dose response analysis somewhat challenging because we really don't have appropriate doses in that low response range to really characterize the dose response particularly well.
So to make sure I understand, what it means is that you have to go by the most sensitive receptor, and there's a big swing.
In some of the endpoints, there is a big swing. I think that would be a reasonable way of saying it, yes. Any questions?
This is Mario from Clean Water Action. I'm wondering, I know as an advocate, I'm struggling keeping up with the data, and so I would like to understand what DEP's process has been for gathering new information, and I'm also wondering whether or not we couldn't have access to what's currently informing your decision making so that we know whether or not we're looking at the same sets of data.
Okay, so did everybody hear the question? Sort of how are we keeping up with the data and what data are we looking at? So first of all, we're not de novo repeating all of the assessments everybody else is doing. So we're starting out by looking at what the other states are doing, what EPA is doing, ATSBR is doing. There's some things that have been happening in the EU. We have reports from the EU that we've been looking at. And then there's some new studies that we've been looking at, including that NTP 28-day study, which is basically just a huge dump of data tables. And we could certainly share all of that with you, make that all available.
So I'm curious then, if you're looking to other states, why is the proposed MCL number currently higher than some other states' recent decisions?
Right, so maybe I should go back to that. So, question number one, are we really higher? I'm not sure, because most other states except Vermont and Connecticut are taking these one at a time. They're not summing across the compounds. They're assuming that Minnesota is sort of summing them, but assuming different relative potencies when they do it. Right? So it's sort of comparing apples and oranges, or pumpkins and oranges. So I really can't say for sure that we're less stringent or more stringent. If you isolate a particular compound, then yeah, for some of them we'll be less stringent if that's the only thing that's showing up in your water. And there may be circumstances, in particular with an industrial source, where that could happen. Most of the data we see, you see multiple compounds showing up. Yes?
I just have a sort of related question to what Mario was asking about with this chart in particular, because I've seen this chart floating around and at a number of presentations. How are you updating that? So it's sort of the similar question of how are you keeping track of state regs and legislation, and also when you're talking to other state regulators or maybe lawmakers generally, are you hearing about things that are bubbling up but not yet making it onto this chart, and finding out what people are basing their proposed draft changes, if they're in process, kind of where they are in a process?
I think right now, with the exception of New Hampshire, that will be changing theirs very soon, that this is up to date.
Okay.
How do we keep up with it? It's because I spent all my time dealing with PFAS and on PFAS conference calls. We had one this morning, which was a New England work group conference call talking about what all the states are doing. So, I think it's pretty much up to date. Now, I won't mention that there are some states that have values. Texas has some values. I don't really understand how they came up with them, so I didn't put them on the chart. Alaska, I think, has some values, but we haven't been able to get the documentation for how to derive them. Michigan just came out with values. They were not included in our original assessment. We're now looking at those.
Is anyone else any other state having a parallel process the way that we are here, that you are doing, with the sort of the waste site cleanup and the MCL development at the same time?
Not that I'm aware of, but I wouldn't.
I think the Vermont number was initially a groundwater number.
Still is.
Yeah.
It's a groundwater discharge number, the Vermont number.
Yeah,
So,
but they just adopted legislation that
Right.
legislatively applies to drinking water.
Right. So that.
but it's guideline. It's still not an MCL though.
It's still not formally an
Yes.
MCL.
So they're beginning the process in Vermont to develop an MCL.
Yeah. And then New Jersey, I'm not sure how they're coordinating programs.
Can I just add on the it is hard. So it is a challenge to keep up with the data and the reports and what other entities are developing for standards. So to the extent any of you hear about new standards being promulgated or new reports coming out, you can just send them to that drinking water email. It's the last slide here, and we will follow the breadcrumbs and try and get to it. And better still, if you get us a link to an actual, proposed rule somewhere or a final rule somewhere.
Yeah.
I actually have two relatively related questions. I didn't want to stop you on your way. You were. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Kristen Mello from Westfield, Massachusetts, from Raft. My questions were first, when you were talking about PFBS and PFHxA and how their toxicity and half-lives were different, how do they, if they don't compare to PFOS and PFOA well, how do they compare to other persistent toxic compounds that we might know about? And then I have a follow-up.
Okay, yeah, and the short answer is we haven't really looked at that closely at this point. That's sort of next on the shelf in terms of taking a look at some of these other compounds once we get through this. Half-lives are still fairly long for those compounds. I mean, they're probably in the range of months as opposed to years, weeks to months. But that's still not a trivial half-life,
Right.
In terms of exposed to other toxic chemicals, less than PCBs and dioxins, but more than a lot of other things. So I wouldn't say they're not a concern, but they're sort of in a different box in terms of level of concern than these other long chain ones.
Right.
At least from our perspective.
Right, okay. I just thought it might be helpful for the people that aren't, you know, as far down the rabbit hole as some of us are, to be able to compare it to something else that is commonly we're aware of, like maybe commercial products and whatnot. Like we'll look it up if we have to. And on your slide that talked about how drinking water standards were, you know, the little equation.
Yeah.
I'm wondering where in that equation is the factor for community members that have suffered long-term chronic high-end exposure. So if we're looking for, you were talking about some people look at 70 kilogram male, you know, adult, and some people look at infant exposure. Where's the factor for communities with generational PFAS drinking water exposure, and how are these standards going to be protective of our communities, you know, where our numbers have been high for so long and we don't even know what's in our blood. So if we institute an MCL, how are we going to make sure that that MCL allows us to have our numbers come down? And if it's not in that equation, can we add it?
It's not in that equation, I'm not sure. I mean, it's this intergenerational risk. I mean, it's a good issue, and I don't really know how we would necessarily account for that. I think at a 20 part per trillion level, you know, if you had been previously exposed to values above that, your levels would come down. That's been sort of the documented trend in situations where drinking water exposures have been remediated and resolved. The blood levels come down over an extended time frame because of those long half-lives. But it does come down. So I guess I don't have a good answer for you on how you would factor in the intergenerational risk issue.
Can we please keep that annotated in this proceeding?
Yeah.
Because I think for a lot of Americans, that's really going to matter to these numbers. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So the RfD values that were used by EPA, so clearly the RfD values they used for PFOA and PFOS were much lower. Exactly how much lower was it compared to EPA's, and was that based on newer toxicology data?
So we applied an additional database on certain factor of square root of 10, 3.33. So our value is 3.33 lower than EPA's RfD.
Where did that 3.33 came?
Well, that came through our evaluation of all of the studies that indicated that there were effects reported and observed at lower exposure, lower dose levels in the animal studies that were not accommodated or accounted for in the EPA value.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Let's go there. Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
Kind of going off of what she was saying, I didn't hit it so well last time. So I hear there's a wide variety of response, species to species, and as well as within species. So it must make it very hard to find like the lowest adverse response level, correct?
No, I wouldn't say it's all that hard to identify. You look at the studies and you can see where those are. The hard point or hard part is determining whether or not a particular low response level is actually of concern to people.
We're tending to be very conservative
I would say we're being reasonably conservative. One could be more conservative, one could be less conservative. You know, it really depends. You know, I'll note the EPA definition of the RfD, that order of magnitude. So we've gone from their value to the lower end, still within that range, that order of magnitude range. So we're still in the ballpark of the original EPA value, but now on the lower end of it. Let's go over here, Jen.
So question on, it seems to me that you're basing most of the others on sort of how you're looking at PFOS, PFOA. Have there been any human studies on PFOA?
Numerous.
Numerous?
Yeah.
And you can provide those as they asked?
Yeah. I mean, most of the studies on PFOS and PFOA, the EPI studies, have been summarized in the EPA analyses, and New Jersey did a great job on it. And the most recent summaries are in the EFSA EU report, where they actually derived an RfD value based on human epidemiological data, which is somewhat a matter of debate right now, whether what they did is appropriate, but it's actually lower than what we're using. Yes?
A follow-up question on human studies.
Yep.
Any sense of the ratio of all the studies, how many or what ratio is human versus other species? And do you put a certain weight on a human study versus a different species?
If it's a good human study, you'd prefer to use it, but
So any idea of the ratio of all the studies?
you know, off the top of my head, no, but there have been a lot of human studies, and they all have one or more limitations. You know, it's just hard to do a human study. It just is. The epi studies are very limited in their sensitivity to detect effects because of what's known as confounding other things that might impact the health of endpoints that you're looking at, which is why a lot of our work defaults to the animal studies, because you can at least control the exposures in the animal studies. But there have been a lot of human studies. The C10 studies down in the southeast U.S., that's where the epi associating testicular cancer and kidney cancer comes from, the cholesterol impacts and some of the other human impacts come from those studies, for example. Philippe Grandjean, who's here at Harvard, has done some studies in the Faroe Islands. Those are the studies that document human effects on immune responses, reduced antibody titers, vaccinations, which are possibly clinically significant, depending on who you talk to. So, but there's a lot.
Number of studies are human studies 10%, 20%, half?
PFOA, probably half.
Yeah.
PFOS, maybe less. The other ones, much less. And the other thing to keep in mind in the human studies, most people aren't exposed to one of these things. We're exposed to a mix of them. So then you get into the problem of trying to differentiate whether or not the effects are associated with PFOS or PFOA. The statistical analysis becomes pretty complicated. Sorry. Oh. Time is probably.
How close are you on the background studies? What's currently present in the background environment?
We are not doing any sort of de novo studies ourselves, but we are aware of the Relied study, and it will be something we'll be taking a close look at.
Mr. Stein, do you,
Being around the pole on the other side might not hear.
do you have standards for the studies that you're using? Like, do they have to be peer reviewed, or what is the quality control, I guess, on the studies that you're using to guide?
So pretty much everything we're looking at are peer-reviewed publications. So, I mean, that's sort of, if it's in the peer-reviewed literature where we can find it, we're using it. We're not getting access to any of the CBI, confidential business information that EPA might have under their TSCA program. We haven't seen any of that.
Hi, Laurel Chater from Silent Spring Institute. I was wondering if your approach has considered the pharmacokinetic models that Minnesota recently issued. I noticed that you were using a lactating woman as the sensitive population, and their results suggested that infants might be the sensitive population to consider.
Yeah, and the answer to that is because we're using the relative source contribution of 20%, if you look at what Minnesota did, I think we're using 50. We think we've captured sufficient, I think we're protecting infant with the use of that 20% contribution. So no, we haven't. And we can chat some more about how they're doing the modeling and what level that will peak over the limit is of concern or not.
So, following up on that, does that mean that the new numbers do not include the NTP information about PFOA, chronic exposure, and pancreatic tumors?
It does not. We haven't looked at that yet. All right. And once, twice. Oh.
I mentioned the Vermont study for looking at background level, just going back to his comment. Are you looking at anything else other than the Vermont study? Because I thought Vermont study mainly focused on the soil background level.
Yeah, mainly focused on the soil, and that's where we would start. Based on the UCMR3 data, most water supplies don't have much of this, so it's probably not a significant background in public water supplies. Private water supplies and impacts maybe situations where you have septic systems nearby, certainly of interest, but we've not started looking at that.
Thank you.
Do you know if other states are, Mario, Clean Water Action, do you know if other states are going the UF route or whether or not they're looking at the toxicity studies instead?
It varies from state to state. I can't remember which is which, but some are doing one and some are doing another. All right, thank you, everyone. Good. Hopefully we saved enough time for you.